Now, joining me for all the news of the week is LNP Senator Gerard Rennick, who's just arrived in Canberra. Welcome, Senator. What was worrying news this week for me was the revelation that the Morrison government spent $20.8 billion, that's a lot of money, on outsourcing the public service to consultants in just one single year. What's going on here? What are we paying all these public servants for if we have to spend another $20 billion on consultants? And it was your mob that did it.
Good evening, Corey. Well, I think it's fair to say we've got too many bureaucrats in this country, full stop. In my maiden speech, I called for a constitutional convention to actually sort out the roles and responsibilities of state governments, because I think we spend way too much money on the bureaucracy, and they've become basically a shadow government within themselves, where they're more interested in regulating and controlling people rather than serving people. So I would still like to see a review of all the bureaucracies. For example, you know, there's a federal education department, there's a state education department, and there's duplication of both, you know, health, water, as I said, education, and energy is another one. AEMOs, you know, I think 40% owned by the states, 30% owned by the private sector, and 20 or 30% owned by the federal government as well. So it's very much a dog's breakfast. And of course, on top of that, you've got the consultants who can't help themselves and give gratuitous advice, basically based on modelling. And we've spoken about modelling before, how the world seems to be based on modelling and not actual real facts. So yeah, look, totally support any sort of review that's going to cut down on that waste.
Yeah, I think so. And a lot of people, of course, will be talking about the federal budget this week. Most of it, I presume most of it has already been leaked. But there are fears that I have about the Treasurer's plans to put up taxes on those of us who are out there working, those who are not fully dependent on government, while handing out more money to those who are dependent on it. You've got a long history in tax expertise. What do you expect to happen?
Well, I don't know what I expect to happen. I haven't seen all the detail yet, but what I know I want to see or would like to see is definitely a cut in income tax for low income earners, and a closing of a lot of the tax loopholes in the Tax Act. There's a couple of big tax loopholes, and I'll name a few of them. I'll start with the first one, and that is Section 59, that basically says that native title payments and mining royalties paid to Aboriginal corporations aren't taxable. There's also Section 50 of the 97 Tax Act that says universities don't have to pay tax. Now, that may have been okay 30 or 40 years ago when they were just educating Australian students, but now that they're earning a lot of money from foreign students, they should pay tax on that. There's also another section in the Tax Act that effectively says foreigners, if they own less than 10% in a non-real asset, i.e. shares or water rights, they don't have to pay capital gains tax. Now, I think it's bad enough that foreigners are allowed to buy water rights in the first place, but I think it's particularly bad that they don't have to pay capital gains tax on those water rights. And there's a raft of other measures, and I would like to see some of these loopholes closed. I actually let the new Treasurer know when he became a Treasurer. I went to see him and point out all these loopholes, because it was the loopholes that I discovered in the Tax Act when I did my Masters of Tax Law at Sydney University that actually drove me to become a politician in the first place, because it creates an unlevel playing field between foreign investors and domestic investors, when foreign investors don't have to pay the same rate of tax as domestic investors or domestic businesses who pay a much higher weighted average cost of capital if their tax rate is higher.
Senator, I've got to tell you, you've left me flabbergasted here, because I didn't know that the billions of dollars in royalties that flow into Aboriginal corporations weren't taxed at all. I didn't know that the billions of dollars that flow into universities from foreign students weren't taxed at all. We're always told this is such a boon for Australia, and yet we've got, something like $80 billion in HECS debt or HELP debt, $20 billion or something that they never expect to be repaid. The foreign investors owning water rights don't have to pay tax on it. This is kind of crazy stuff, and I'm a low tax person. I like less tax, but why are we having to pay for it when others aren't?
Because we've been brainwashed by big media and big corporations for the last 3 to 4 decades, saying that we've always relied on foreign capital, i.e. foreign debt. And that's a complete insult to the working class people of this country. The words of our national anthem says wealth for toil. What we have as a sovereign country is title already. We have equity. if we have to expand the volume of capital in this country, we should do it by issuing new shares against infrastructure, sovereign infrastructure like coal-powered fire stations, baseload powered power stations, dams, road, rail, ports, airports and telecommunications. Those assets are natural monopolies. They don't fit under the banner of capitalism because true capitalism involves a risk-reward paradigm. And many big corporations, monopolies today, don't have any downside risk because they're too big to fail. So at the moment, things get a bit shaky, and you can look at the banks in both the GFC and COVID. They both get they all got bailed out by the Australian taxpayer. So, there's been this mythology that we've always relied on foreign debt, and as a result of that, we've bent over backwards to give significant tax discounts to foreigners at the expense of domestic capital. And that has effectively resulted in the decline of our manufacturing industry here in Australia. Now, while I accept we've got other issues with industrial relations when it comes to manufacturing that also need to be improved, the tax incentives have made it very difficult for any large-scale manufacturing organisation to compete here in Australia.
Yeah, well, I just don't know how letting foreign students pay billions to universities without them having to pay any tax is doing much good for us, and particularly when we're spending $30 billion on Indigenous welfare every year, not expecting Indigenous corporations to pay tax on the royalties they receive. It just seems a bit odd to me. Senator Rennick, you've got a big week ahead of you in Parliament. I know you'll be scrutinising that budget within an inch of its life and more strength to your arm, because we need to expose these loopholes and more. Thanks for joining me on Bernardi tonight. Really appreciate it.